Autumn 1861, Central London. A 19-year-old girl named Matilda Sayre starts vomiting a thin green liquid. Her fingernails have turned green. The whites of her eyes have turned green. She tells her doctor that everything she looks at is green. Within days, she is dead, convulsing and foaming from the mouth, the nose, and the eyes. She was not poisoned by an enemy. She was poisoned by her job. But Matilda's death was the end point of a pattern stretching back more than 6,000 years. A pattern where the most desired beauty products and the deadliest poisons were the exact same substance. Doctors warned, in writing, for millennia. Women kept painting their faces with lead, mercury, and arsenic anyway. Not because they were stupid. Because in a world where beauty determined who you married, what you inherited, and whether you survived, slow poisoning was the rational choice. This is the story of how that happened. It starts in Egypt, around 4000 BCE, in the floodplains along the Nile River. And it starts with eyeliner. The Egyptian word for their signature cosmetic was mesdemet, and it was everywhere. Kings wore it, priests wore it, soldiers marching into the desert wore it, laborers building the pyramids at Giza wore it. Women, men, and children across every social class in ancient Egypt lined their eyes with Kohl, a thick black paste made primarily from galena, which is lead sulfide, ground into powder and mixed with animal fat or gum. When archaeologists opened the tomb of Tutankhamun in 1922, they found Kohl pots and applicators buried alongside the golden death mask. But when they opened the tombs of ordinary workmen from the same period, they found Kohl pots there too. This was not a luxury, it was as universal as soap. And it was not just decorative. The thick almond-shaped eyeline imitated the wedjat, the eye of Horus, the sacred eye torn out by the god Set and magically restored. The Egyptian word for makeup palette literally derives from a root meaning to protect. Wearing Kohl was religious, it was medical, and in 2010, a team of French scientists proved it was something nobody expected. Philippe Walter and Christian Amator at the Louvre and the French National Center for Scientific Research published an analysis of 52 ancient Kohl containers from the museum's Egyptian collection. What they found was wild. Roughly 75% of the samples were lead-based, which was expected. But buried in those samples were two compounds called laurionite and phosgenite that essentially do not exist in nature. The Egyptians did not dig these chemicals out of the ground. They made them. They soaked lead oxide in salt water with natron for up to 40 days in a deliberate wet chemistry process around 2000 BCE. This is the earliest known example of large-scale chemical synthesis in human history. And when the researchers exposed cultured human skin cells to those compounds, the cells released a 240-fold burst of nitric oxide, which recruits immune cells to fight infection. Egyptian Kohl was an engineered antibiotic disguised as eyeliner, developed 2,000 years before anyone understood what a germ was. In the swampy Nile floodplain, where trachoma and conjunctivitis were epidemic, that protection was life or death. So the world's first chemists may have been Egyptian makeup artists. That is an incredible start to this story. But the story does not stay incredible for long. Cross the Mediterranean Sea to Athens, around the 6th century BCE, and the chemistry of beauty takes a darker turn. The Greeks inherited Egyptian cosmetics, but stripped away the medicine and kept the poison. Their signature product was called psimethion, and it was synthetic white lead, a chalky corrosive powder made by suspending a brick-sized piece of lead over a pot of vinegar for 10 days, scraping off the white crust that formed, and grinding it into face paint. Why white? Because the Greek beauty ideal was leukotes, whiteness. When Homer describes the most beautiful women in the Iliad and the Odyssey, Hera, Helen, Penelope, the repeated epithet is white-armed. White skin meant you lived indoors, which meant you were wealthy, which meant you were virtuous and feminine. Tanned skin meant you worked in the fields. So Greek women smeared lead carbonate across their faces and necks to fake the complexion of a woman who never had to labor. And this is where the control starts. Around 362 BCE, the Athenian writer Xenophon tells a story in his O Economicus. A wealthy man named Ischomachus catches his teenage wife wearing white lead and red alkanet juice on her face. He sits her down and lectures her. He tells her that cosmetics are a form of fraud, comparable to a husband lying about his net worth. He tells her that real beauty comes from kneading dough and folding laundry. Plato called cosmetics a mischievous, deceitful, mean, and ignoble practice. Think about that for a second. The intellectual argument that makeup equals deception is 2,400 years old, and it was built by men to control their wives in a society where men were the ones demanding women look pale in the first place. The Greeks did know the stuff was toxic. Hippocrates documented colic in lead miners around 400 BCE. Dioscorides described Simethian's dangers. Galen, the most famous physician of the ancient world, actually invented cold cream as a safer alternative, a formula of beeswax, olive oil, and rosewater that is still essentially identical to what you would find in a drugstore today. Greek temples even banned women from wearing white lead when entering sacred spaces. So the priests banned it at the altar. The philosophers called it fraud. The doctors said it was poison, and women kept using it because nobody was offering them a world where being beautiful did not matter. Then Rome took all of this and cranked the dial to maximum. The Roman beauty routine combined 3 poisons into a single daily regimen. Ceruse, white lead, went on as foundation. Minium, which is red lead oxide, and cinnabar, mercury sulfide, went on the cheeks and lips. And for the eyes, Roman women dropped juice from the deadly nightshade plant directly onto their eyeballs. The science of what that last one does is disturbing on a level that's hard to overstate. Deadly nightshade, Atropa belladonna, contains atropine, a chemical that blocks specific receptors on the muscles of the iris. When those receptors get blocked, the pupil dilates wide and stays dilated for 4 to 10 days. Dilated pupils are an involuntary signal of sexual arousal. Roman women were using a plant extract to chemically fake the look of desire. The trade-off was blurred vision, inability to focus, racing heartbeat, hallucinations, and over months of repeated use, permanent blindness. As little as 600 milligrams taken orally could kill. Roman women traded their eyesight for eyes that looked turned on. And that is not a metaphor. That is pharmacology. Pliny the Elder, writing his natural history around 77 CE, called Ceruse a deadly poison in plain Latin. He documented miners crushing cinnabar wearing masks made from animal bladder skin over their faces, the earliest known respiratory protection in history. He was describing the men who manufactured women's makeup wearing the ancient equivalent of hazmat gear, while the women applying the product to their own faces had nothing. And who actually put this paint on? In most wealthy Roman households, the answer was an ornatrix, a specialized makeup artist who was almost always an enslaved woman. The poet Martial recorded a scene of a Roman lady named Lalage stabbing her enslaved ornatrix with a hairpin and tearing her skin because she misplaced a curl. That enslaved woman absorbed the same lead dust and mercury fumes as her mistress, all day, every day, but with no choice and no status. The Roman poet Ovid captures the entire hypocrisy of this world in 2 texts. In his Medicamina Faciae Feminae, he gives women actual cosmetic recipes and promises them they will shine smoother than their own mirror. In his Ars Amatoria, he tells women to paint, to wax, to whiten. But then in the Remedia Amoris, he tells men a trick for falling out of love. Sneak into your lover's room while she is getting ready and watch her apply her makeup. See the open bottles, the sweat, the effort. That, Ovid says, will kill your desire instantly. So Roman culture told women to be beautiful, sold them poison to do it, enslaved other women to apply it, and then mocked them for wearing it. The Latin word medicamina meant both medicine and poison. The Italian word for makeup today, trucco, still literally means trick. Physicians had been publishing warnings about cosmetic lead and mercury for 1,000 years by the time Rome fell. Nobody with the power to change things listened. And when medieval Europe rose from the ruins, the church arrived with a completely different objection. Not that cosmetics were dangerous, that they were sinful, and somehow that made everything worse. Around 200 CE, a North African theologian named Tertullian sat down and wrote a treatise called De Cultu Feminarum on the apparel of women. In it, he traced cosmetics back to the fallen angels of Genesis chapter 6, the ones who supposedly taught women metallurgy and eye paint to seduce mortal men. His conclusion was blunt. He told every woman who painted her face, "You are the devil's gateway." A generation later, Saint Cyprian of Carthage went further. He warned that any woman who wore cosmetics had polluted her skin with a false medicament and imitated the red and painted eyes of the serpent. His promise was that she would burn alongside the devil whose style she had copied. For over 1,000 years of medieval European Christianity, this was the framework. Cosmetics were not just vain, they were demonic. The Church Fathers treated a pot of rouge the way they treated a pact with Satan. But then Thomas Aquinas, the most influential theologian of the medieval period, carved out an exception in his Summa Theologiae that locked the trap shut. He ruled that a married woman who adorned herself to please her husband could do so without sin. Read that carefully. A woman must be beautiful for her husband. She must never be beautiful for herself. If she painted her face out of personal desire, it was pride, a mortal sin. If she painted it because her husband demanded it, she was simply being a good wife. The double bind was now official church doctrine. And the poisons kept flowing. Because, while the theologians were writing sermons, medieval aristocratic women were still plastering white lead across their faces, plucking their entire hairlines backward by inches to achieve the fashionable oval forehead, and removing every visible eyebrow and eyelash. Look at Rogier van der Weyden's portrait of Isabella of Portugal from the 15th century. That massive, dome-like forehead and those invisible brows are not artistic license. That is what wealthy women actually looked like. And the one person writing all of this down from a woman's perspective was a figure attached to the name Trotula of Salerno. Sometime in the 12th century, at the only medieval medical school in Europe that admitted women, a text called De Ornatu Mulierum appeared, on women's cosmetics, organized head to toe. Depilatory recipes that are chemically identical to modern hair removal cream. Skin treatments using marshmallow, rose water, and egg yolk that a 2022 dermatological review confirmed have legitimate medical logic. Trotula's text even credits Muslim women for specific techniques, evidence that cosmetic knowledge was flowing across religious lines in Norman Sicily. This was real science, quietly practiced by women, while male theologians called the whole enterprise satanic. But none of it could compete with what was coming out of Venice. By the 1400s, Venice controlled three things that made it the cosmetics capital of the Western world: the Mediterranean alum trade, the white lead pigment supply for painters like Titian and Tintoretto, and the spice and aromatics routes from the Eastern Mediterranean. On a single day in April of 1561, one Venetian cargo vessel exported 100 barrels of lead white from its docks. The premium Renaissance cosmetic was called Venetian Ceruse, and alchemists knew it as spirits of Saturn, named for lead's planetary association with slowness and melancholy. It was an emulsion of water, vinegar, and basic lead carbonate, and it worked. Lead was antibacterial, antifungal, and brilliantly opaque. It produced a luminous, lily-white finish that no plant-based alternative could match. Modern researchers confirmed on pig skin that the vinegar's acetic acid stripped natural oils and allowed lead to penetrate the subcutaneous layer. The glow was real, and that was the problem. This is where the vicious cycle that defines this entire story kicks into high gear. The lead damaged the skin. The damaged skin needed more lead to cover the damage. More lead meant more absorption. More absorption meant graying skin, scarring, hair loss, including eyebrows and hairlines, blackened teeth, tremors, infertility, miscarriage, and eventually paralysis or total organ failure. Women applied this mixture to face, neck, and chest. 6-year-old girls were painted alongside their mothers. And when women tried mercury sublimate, mercuric chloride, as a skin peel to fix the damage. It literally corroded the top layer of skin off, leaving smoother but visibly aged tissue underneath, plus tremor, gum ulceration, loose teeth, and the paranoid mood swings that would later be called mad as a hatter syndrome. The physical evidence still exists. When archaeologists examined the skull of Isabella of Aragon, who entered Milan in 1488 and was mocked for her dark complexion, they found her tooth enamel darkened by mercury and scrape marks on the teeth, where she had tried to remove the stains, apparently while looking in a mirror. That detail is one of the most haunting traces of cosmetic damage in the archaeological record. And Italian women were also dropping deadly nightshade juice into their eyes for the dilated, doe-eyed look, just like the Romans. That is where the plant gets its name, belladonna, beautiful lady. One drop dilated the pupil for 4 to 10 days. This is where the story takes a turn nobody expected. Because when your only legal escape from an abusive husband is his death, and divorce is literally impossible under church and civil law, and you are already surrounded by poisons on your dressing table, eventually someone figures out a business model. Her name was Julia Tofana, or more accurately, her name was a legend built from 3 real women across 3 generations. Teofania di Adamo was executed in Palermo in July of 1633, sealed alive in a sack and thrown from the roof of the bishop's palace. Julia Tofana, possibly Teofania's daughter, moved the operation through Naples to Rome and likely died in her own bed around 1651. And Girolamo Spara took over after Julia's death and was hanged in the Campo de' Fiori in Rome in July of 1659. What they sold was Aqua Tofana, arsenic trioxide dissolved in water, colorless, odorless, tasteless, bottled in small glass vials labeled Manna of Street Nicholas of Bari, which was a popular devotional oil that supposedly seeped from the bones of the saint in his crypt. And yes, that is the same Saint Nicholas who became the original Father Christmas. The bottles featured his face on the label. A vial of poison could sit openly on a woman's dressing table among her perfumes and rosary beads, devotional and untraceable. One writer noted a century later that there was not a lady in Naples who did not have some of it lying openly on her toilette. The chemistry was designed for patience. Small repeated doses produced symptoms that mimicked natural illness: malaise, then stomach trouble, then weakness, then cardiac failure over weeks or months. No doctor could explain why simple ailments did not respond to treatment, and arsenic was completely undetectable in a corpse until James Marsh invented his chemical test in 1836, nearly 200 years later. There was one more detail that made it perfect. The slow progression gave the dying husband enough time to call a priest and confess his sins, so his soul went to heaven. The wife could poison him and still feel she had done right by his salvation. The reputed body count of 600 husbands is almost certainly inflated. But the reality underneath the legend: a network of women across southern Italy quietly selling arsenic labeled with a saint's face to other women trapped in violent marriages where no legal exit existed. That is documented and real. And the name still had power centuries later. In the autumn of 1791, Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart lay dying in Vienna. He told his wife Constanze that he was certain someone had poisoned him. "Someone has given me Aqua Tofana," he said, "and calculated the precise time of my death." The poison had been gone for over 130 years. Its name still terrified the dying. But the most famous victim of cosmetic poison didn't buy it on a street corner. She wore it like a crown. And it may have killed her. Elizabeth Tudor became Queen of England in November of 1558. She was 25, pale-skinned, red-haired, and by every contemporary account, striking. The Tudor beauty ideal she inherited was almost absurdly specific. Skin white as snow, cheeks and lips red as blood, eyes dark as ebony. Literally the description of Snow White, which is not a coincidence. That fairy tale draws on the same centuries-old European beauty code, and the chemistry to achieve it was identical to what women in Venice and Rome had been using for 1,000 years. Venetian Ceruse, lead carbonate ground fine and mixed with vinegar, went on as foundation. Vermilion, mercury sulfide, went on the cheeks and lips. Mercuric chloride was used to bleach freckles. And the cleanser to remove it all at night was a mixture of rosewater, mercury, honey, and eggshells, which was somehow worse than the makeup itself. Over the dried Ceruse mask, women applied an egg-white glaze that dried to a porcelain-like finish, and that finish cracked when the wearer smiled, frowned, or moved her face in any direction. Which is one reason Elizabethan court etiquette demanded an almost completely immobile expression. That was not just fashion, it was structural necessity. You could not emote without your face falling apart. Then came October of 1562. Elizabeth, aged 29, collapsed with fever at Hampton Court Palace. Her doctor, a German physician named Burkott, diagnosed smallpox. She was wrapped in red flannel by the fire and survived. In her delirium, she reportedly named Robert Dudley as Lord Protector. Tradition holds that she emerged from the illness pitted with pockmarks. She would conceal with Ceruse for the remaining 4 decades of her life. Some modern historians push back on this and argue contemporary sources rarely mention visible scars. But whether the Ceruse was hiding pockmarks or projecting political control, 1562 is the turning point. From that year forward, Elizabeth's face was never truly seen in public again. And that was by design. Because the mask of youth was not vanity, it was national security. Elizabeth had no husband and no named heir. Any visible sign of aging, any crack in the image of the ageless Virgin Queen, risked destabilizing the succession. Foreign powers and domestic factions were watching her face for weakness, the way intelligence agencies today watch satellite imagery. So, around 1594, the miniaturist Nicholas Hilliard devised a schematic, ageless version of Elizabeth's face that became the only authorized template for every portrait painted until her death. The trigger was an unflinching portrait by Isaac Oliver in 1592 that showed a wrinkled, gaunt, visibly aging woman. It was effectively suppressed. In 1596, her chief minister Robert Cecil issued a proclamation ordering all unflattering portraits of the Queen destroyed and forbidding any new portraits until Hilliard finished an approved pattern that painters could copy. A Queen's face, replaced by a logo, and underneath that logo, the lead kept accumulating. But the political performance was only half the story. The physical cost was mounting, and the eyewitness accounts from her final years are brutal. Paul Hentzner, a German lawyer who saw Elizabeth at Greenwich Palace in 1598 when she was 65, described her face as oblong, fair but wrinkled, her eyes small yet black and pleasant, her nose slightly hooked, her lips narrow, and her teeth black. A defect the English seem subject to from their too great use of sugar. Her hair was auburn but false. The French ambassador André Hurol de Maisse visited in 1597 and noted her teeth were very yellow and unequal, with so many missing that she was difficult to understand when she spoke quickly. Elizabeth was so terrified of tooth extraction that the Bishop of London, John Aylmer, volunteered to have one of his own teeth pulled out in front of her just to show her it could be survived. And then there is Father Anthony Rivers, a hostile Jesuit observer, who wrote in 1600 that Elizabeth was continuously painted, not only all over her face, but on her very neck and breast also, in some places near ½ an inch thick. Around the same year, Shakespeare gave Hamlet a line in the graveyard scene that almost certainly pointed at the painted, aging queen sitting in the audience. Now get you to my lady's chamber, and tell her, let her paint an inch thick, to this favour she must come. The skull in Hamlet's hand, the painted queen in the front row, the playwright daring her to hear it, and then the decline accelerated. What happened in her final months reads like a clinical description of cumulative heavy metal poisoning. After the execution of the Earl of Essex in 1601 and the death of her cousin, the Countess of Nottingham, in early 1603, Elizabeth fell into what one courtier called settled and unremovable melancholy. Memory loss. sudden rages, insomnia that stretched for days, hair loss, gum recession, her remaining teeth falling out, the skin under the ceruse eroding. Her coronation ring, which she had worn for 45 years as a symbol of her marriage to England, had to be filed off her swollen finger. The court read it as an omen. When Robert Cecil urged her to go to bed, she turned on him and snapped, "Must. Is must a word to be addressed to princes? Little man, thy father, if he had been alive, durst not have used that word." She refused to lie down for nearly 2 weeks, reportedly telling her attendants she was afraid she would never rise again. She finally collapsed onto cushions piled on the floor of her chamber, where she sat for 4 days, finger in her mouth, eyes fixed on the ground, barely speaking. Elizabeth died at Richmond Palace around 2 in the morning on the 24th of March, 1603. She was 69. She had reigned for 45 years. She forbade an autopsy. One of her maids of honor, Lady Elizabeth Southwell, later wrote that near the end, someone brought the Queen a true looking-glass for the first time in 20 years. And when Elizabeth saw her real face, she screamed and raged at everyone who had ever complimented her. Southwell also claimed the Queen's corpse swelled so badly it burst through the lead-lined coffin during the funeral vigil. And the poet Ben Jonson later wrote the epitaph for the whole era. Queen Elizabeth never saw herself, after she became old, in a true glass. They painted her, and sometimes would vermilion her nose. A queen whose face was a state secret died because she could not stop painting it. Ceruse was not classified as a poison in England until 1634, 31 years after. It probably helped kill her. But across the English Channel, in the courts of Versailles and the drawing rooms of Georgian London, cosmetic poisoning was about to produce its most concentrated tragedy. A woman so beautiful that a shoemaker charged a penny per look at her shoe, and so doomed that she would be dead at 27. At the court of Versailles in the 18th century, wearing rouge was not a personal choice, it was a uniform. Blanc de Ceruse, the same lead white that had been killing women since ancient Greece, went on thickly over face, neck, and chest. Some women painted thin blue veins across their skin in cobalt to fake the appearance of translucent, aristocratic pallor. Rouge was applied in bold, unblended circles on the cheeks, and the shade you wore broadcast your rank. High-status women used vermilion. Lower ranks used cochineal. By the 1780s, French women were collectively buying roughly 2 million pots of rouge a year. Even the blemishes got accessorized. Black velvet, or taffeta beauty patches, called mouches, originally existed to hide smallpox scars and syphilitic sores, but they evolved into a coded language on the face. A patch at the corner of the eye was called l'assassine, the killer. On the forehead, la majestueuse. At the corner of the mouth, la baiseuse, the kiss. In England, Whig women patched the right cheek and Tory women the left, and the essayist Joseph Addison joked in The Spectator in 1711 about ladies switching sides between parties and ballrooms on the same night. Underneath all of this theatre, people were still dying. And the death of Maria Gunning is the single most concentrated tragedy in this entire 6,000-year story. Maria and her sister Elizabeth were born to impoverished Irish gentry. They had no money, no connections, and no dowries. What they had was beauty so extreme it reportedly caused public disturbances. At a Dublin ball in 1748, the sisters wore costumes borrowed from a theatre company, playing Lady Macbeth and Juliet, and dazzled the Lord Lieutenant of Ireland. By 1750, they had been presented at the court of St. James in London, and Horace Walpole wrote that they were 2 Irish girls of no fortune, who make more noise than any of their predecessors since the days of Helen, and who are declared the handsomest women alive. The hysteria was real. A Worcester shoemaker reportedly earned 2.5 guineas by charging a penny per peep at a shoe he was making for Maria. King George II assigned her an armed guard for walks in Hyde Park. She married the 6th Earl of Coventry on the 5th of March, 1752, and almost immediately, her husband began trying to control her face. At a dinner in Paris, in front of 16 guests, Coventry suspected his wife had secretly applied a little rouge. Horace Walpole recorded what happened next. He chased her around the dinner table, seized her, and scrubbed the color off her face with a napkin by force, in public, in front of everyone. At the same time, Coventry was keeping a mistress, the famous courtesan Kitty Fisher. Maria encountered Kitty in Hyde Park one afternoon and asked who had made her dress. Kitty told her to ask Lord Coventry, since he had paid for it. Maria Gunning died on the 30th of September, 1760, in a darkened bedroom. She was 27 years old. Walpole wrote that she had been killed, like Coventry and others, by white lead, of which nothing could break her. Modern medicine reads her cause of death as tuberculosis made catastrophically worse by chronic lead poisoning. Kitty Fisher died 7 years later, in 1767, age 25. Same combination: tuberculosis and lead. The National Portrait Gallery's own notes confirm lead poisoning as a contributing cause. Lord Coventry lost both his wife and his mistress to white lead within 7 years. The man who scraped rouge off his wife's face at a dinner party watched the same poison kill the woman he replaced her with. By the time Queen Victoria took the throne in 1837, the rules had flipped on the surface, but not underneath. Victoria officially declared visible cosmetics vulgar, the province of actresses and prostitutes. Respectable women were supposed to achieve beauty through health, pinching their cheeks for color and biting their lips for redness. The result was not less makeup. It was a massive underground cosmetics economy, sold by mail order and advertised in the back pages of women's magazines, hidden from public view but thriving in private. And the beauty target had gotten even more disturbing. Until Robert Koch identified the tuberculosis bacillus in 1882, consumption was romanticized in literature and art. Charlotte Bronte, watching her sister Anne die of the disease, wrote that consumption, I am aware, is a flattering malady. The TB look, emaciation, ghostly pallor, flushed cheeks, dilated, sparkling eyes, became the aspirational beauty standard. Arsenic gave women the pallor, belladonna gave them the eyes, tight lacing gave them the waist, rouge gave them the hectic flush. Victorian women were dressing themselves up to look like they were dying, because dying looked beautiful. And now the poisons were being sold over the counter with advertising copy. Dr. James P. Campbell's safe arsenic complexion wafers hit the American market around 1887 and were sold through the Sears Roebuck catalog. Dr. Mackenzie's improved harmless arsenic complexion wafers launched in Britain in 1893 with the tagline, "One box will produce the most lovely complexion that the imagination could desire." The wafers worked by destroying red blood cells and dilating capillaries. Small doses really did produce pallor with a faint pink flush. But chronic use caused thickened skin on the palms, white lines across the fingernails, and cancers. And the cruelest irony of all, women who took arsenic to look paler eventually developed diffuse darkening of the skin, the exact opposite of what they wanted. Meanwhile, the color green was killing people who had nothing to do with cosmetics. Victorian dresses, wallpapers, and artificial flowers used a pigment called Scheele's green, copper acetorsenite, which shed arsenic dust with every movement. When the 19-year-old Matilda Schürer died in 1861, the girl from the opening of this video, a chemist named August Wilhelm Hoffmann, calculated that an average decorative headdress carried enough arsenic to poison 20 people, and a 20-yard ball gown contained 900 grains, shedding 60 every night on the dance floor. A British medical journal noted that the wearer of such a gown actually carries in her skirts poison enough to slay the whole of the admirers she may meet with in half a dozen ballrooms. And in Bond Street, London, a former East End rabbit-skin seller named Sarah Rachel Russell was running the most brazen cosmetics fraud of the century. Trading as Madame Rachel, she operated a salon at 47 A New Bond Street under the slogan "Beautiful Forever," and sold bottles of magnetic rock dew water of the Sahara for the modern equivalent of about $160 each. When her products were analyzed at trial, they turned out to be water, full as earth, and starch. She was convicted in 1868 and again in 1878. She died in Woking Prison in 1880. Then, there was the Florence Maybrick trial in 1889, an American woman married to a Liverpool cotton broker convicted of murdering him with arsenic. Her defense was that she had soaked arsenical flypapers to extract arsenic for a face wash, an authentic and widely used cosmetic recipe of the period. A pharmacist testified at trial that ladies came to buy flypapers when no flies were about. The cosmetic arsenic economy was so normal that it became a literal murder defense in a British courtroom. And none of this was exclusively a women's burden. Between roughly 1764 and 1775, young aristocratic men, known as the Macaroni Men, returned from their grand tour of Europe wearing 18-inch powdered wigs, tiny tricorn hats, pink and pea-green silk suits, white lead foundation, rouge, and red lip pomade. The verse Yankee Doodle stuck a feather in his cap and called it macaroni is not nonsense. It is mocking Americans for thinking one feather could match the cosmetic excess of these men. Toxic beauty had no gender, but the 20th century was about to produce one final horror. Something that made lead and mercury and arsenic look almost quaint, because the newest miracle ingredient in women's face cream was radioactive. Marie and Pierre Curie isolated radium in 1898 in their Paris laboratory. Within a decade, the beauty industry had claimed it. A London company called Radium launched a full cosmetics line in 1914 with the tagline, "An ever-flowing fountain of youth and beauty has at last been found in the energy rays of radium." They sold night cream, rouge, talcum powder, hair tonic, soap, and radium-infused chin straps and forehead pads that were, according to the advertising, guaranteed to remain radioactive for 20 years. In Paris, a brand called Radium launched in 1933, founded by a pharmacist named Alexis Moussali and a completely fictitious doctor named Alfred Curie, designed to sound like he was related to Marie. Each jar of Radium cream contained a measured dose of radium bromide, and the slogan was direct: "Science has created Radium to beautify women. Whoever wants can stay ugly." That was only round one. The reckoning came not through cosmetics, but through a factory in Orange, New Jersey. The United States Radium Corporation hired young women to paint clock dials with radium-laced luminous paint. The numbers glowed in the dark, and the work required a fine brush tip. Supervisors instructed the women to shape the bristles by rolling them between their lips. Lip, dip, paint. Lip, dip, paint. Hundreds of times a day. A dial painter named Molly Maggiore began losing her teeth in 1921. Then her jaw started to hurt. Then it started to crumble. When her dentist reached into her mouth to examine the damage, he lifted her entire lower mandible out in his hands. The bone had disintegrated. Molly Maggiore died in September of 1922, age 24. Her death certificate listed syphilis. That was a lie, written to protect the company. Radium mimics calcium in the body. It deposits in bone and emits short-range alpha particles that shatter DNA from the inside. The women were being eaten alive by their own skeletons. In 1927, a dial painter named Grace Fryer and 4 other women sued U.S. Radium Corporation. They became known as the Radium Girls. The lawsuit and the autopsies performed by pathologist Harrison Martland, who proved the radium was destroying the women's bones from within, helped establish the foundations of American industrial disease law and workers' right to sue employers for occupational illness. But it took the cosmetics industry another decade to face any regulation at all. In 1933, the FDA assembled a traveling exhibit called the American Chamber of Horrors, displaying photographs of women disfigured by unregulated beauty products. One of the featured cases was Hazel Faye Musa, who was blinded and ultimately killed by an eyelash dye called Lash Lure, which contained a corrosive chemical that burned through her eyes. That same year, the exhibit toured the country. The photographs were difficult to look at, and in 1938, the United States Congress finally passed the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. The the first federal regulation of cosmetics in American history. It had taken 6,000 years, from Egyptian coal pots to radium chin straps, for any government to say that beauty products needed to be safe. So the story ends there, right? Not exactly. Lead acetate remained a permitted ingredient in American hair dye until the FDA formally revoked its approval in 2018. There is still no statutory maximum for trace lead in United States cosmetics. In 2007, the Campaign for Safe Cosmetics tested 33 brand-name lipsticks from stores across the country. 2/3 of them contained detectable lead. In 2010, the FDA ran its own follow-up test on 20 lipsticks. Lead was found in every single one. The highest reading was from a Maybelline color sensational shade called Pink Petal, 7.19 parts per million of lead. The chemistry that killed Maria Gunning in 1760 is, in trace amounts, still on our lips. Look at the whole arc of this story. For 6,000 years, the cycle repeated itself. Lead damaged the skin, so women applied more lead. Mercury destroyed teeth, so they inserted wax cheek plumpers to fill the hollows. Lead caused hair loss, so they glued on wigs with mercury pomade. Arsenic erased freckles by causing worse lesions. Belladonna gave women seductive eyes that could not see. Every cure for the damage required more of the poison that caused it. And the safer alternatives always existed: henna, saffron, turmeric, rosewater, almond oil, beeswax, crushed berries, beetroot, rice powder. Galen's cold cream formula from 2,000 years ago is still essentially modern moisturizer. The technology to be beautiful without poisoning yourself was available in every single era we just covered. But the safe options were never as dramatic, never as white, never as luminous, never as expensive. The market for poison existed because poison signaled wealth, and the market was built, supplied, and profited from almost entirely by men, while women absorbed the cost in their teeth, their bones, their eyesight, their children, and their lives. A 19-year-old in London who died seeing green. An Irish countess dead at 27. A queen who screamed when she finally saw her own face. A factory girl whose jaw came out in her dentist's hands. 2007. A laboratory in Washington, D.C. A lipstick is tested. The number on the screen reads 7.19 parts per million. That story is still being written.